I just want to say thank you for everyone for coming here. My name's Laura. I'm the reference librarian here in Door County. We do have a couple programs coming up this week after today. We have a genealogy club on Thursday afternoon. It has to do with Door County or any part of the country or the world, and you're welcome to join us. And then Friday we have a young lady doing a program on gardening, companion gardening, and she will be describing how you can benefit one plant by planting it next to other plants that are compatible. So that's those are all on our library calendar. The Zoom links will be there, so you can join us Friday if you're interested in that at 10 o'clock, I think it is. Today we have Larry Desotell, who is well known as a history presenter at Learning and Retirement, and he's done programs here at the library, and I'm very thankful he's agreed to do this. We actually arranged this before the whole COVID virus situation, but it works out really well to do it on Zoom. I just want to mention that Larry has a new book that's coming out in September. I think the release date will be September 20th. He may tell you something more about it, but for anyone who can see that, it's on the subject of Confederate rest, which he has done programs on in the past. He did a program here on it, and it's a really fascinating subject. Larry's a retired history teacher in high school in Heartland, Wisconsin. He taught history, political science, and government. And Larry, do you want to tell us a little bit about this book that's coming out?
Sure. I started working on that in 2015. It's about 1,200 Confederate prisoners that were brought to Camp Randall for about 6 weeks, April and May of 1862. Of those 1,200 prisoners, 140 of them died and are buried at Forest Hill Cemetery, which, if you know Madison, is very close, is right by Madison West High School, about 1.5 miles from Camp Randall. And it's about the soldiers, in particular the 1st Alabama and the 1st Alabama, Tennessee and Mississippi regiments. So there's 2 of those. And then also the 19th Wisconsin, which was their guards. It's about, the death rate. It's about, it's also got a chapter, why they fought and were they connected to slavery, and which is always an ongoing argument in history about how much slavery played a role in secession and why people joined. And then I conclude with a chapter on the current controversy, because back in October of 17, 2 monuments that were at the cemetery were removed by vote of the city council in Madison. So it's about that. So it's an overall treatment. I tried to write it for people who I explain everything. I know some people thought that was too much, but I know that as being a high school teacher, I never assumed that anybody ever knew anything, because that was always safe in high school. You could get that was true, because not only was it safe, it was true. No, hardly anybody knew anything. But the idea is that if you bring up like the prison system and you don't explain the prison system, you can't assume that people are going to know what I'm talking about. So there's a lot of detail. I think you might enjoy it. I'm going to put something up where you can get at it if you want to pre-order it and have it delivered to you. I'm going to do that at the break. We're going to take about a 5-minute break halfway through, so I can see. One thing I never know is if the material I have is going to fit within the time frame that I have. So I may have to make some adjustments. So but that's what that book's about, and I would be honored if you would consider buying it.
And today is the actual anniversary, the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment. So it's really a great day to talk about this subject, and you're going to focus, I believe, a little bit on Wisconsin.
Right.
And
that's going to be a big part about basically the failure in Wisconsin to do much about it until the very, very, very end. It's interesting because Wisconsin prides itself on being the first state to ratify the amendment, but there were lots of states that had already allowed women to vote before the amendment came in, and Wisconsin was not really one of those. So it's an interesting it's an interesting paradox.
Okay, do you want to get started with your PowerPoint?
Might as well. Again, I want to thank Laura and I want to thank Morgan for helping out with this, and for you guys for spending your time and coming in, because it is a gorgeous day. But I hope you'll enjoy it. Most importantly, as I go through this, what I'm going to try to get across is, well, I mean, think about it. You know, you say the suffrage movement as if it is a single entity. It wasn't. It was, there were a variety of different groups that came in with different perspectives, different goals to this issue. And it lasted over, you know, basically, if you want to say the women's movement began in 1848 with the Seneca Falls Convention, that's, you know, 75 years, basically. That's 3 generations of women that fought for this, that finally were able to get an amendment passed. So that's going to be a big part of what we're going to take a look at, is the different elements of the women's movement and what they were responding to. Then the next thing is going to be, as Laura pointed out, there's going to be some there's going to be a discussion or a treatment of the movement in this great state of Wisconsin. And then as well as that, then the final push on the national level to get the amendment passed. So that's what this is going to be about. And that's why I borrowed from the Beatles with the long and winding road, because that's kind of what it was. It was no short path to get to the point where women
Do you want to go see?
You know, think of what Lincoln said in his Gettysburg Address. You know, he talked about a new birth of freedom. Well, we have to have a new birth of freedom a lot in our history. That has to come together. And for those of you who are wondering, because I know I got this question when I did a presentation on the Gettysburg Address on November 19th, which is the day of the Gettysburg Address. Somebody at LAR raised their hand and wanted to know if I knew that was the day that it took place. I said, no, it was just a lucky guess. So this is a great day. I did ask a couple women today that I ran into at the barbershop and over at Edward Jones if they knew what today was the 100th anniversary was, and we were 0 for 3. So hopefully people will become aware of the great struggle that women had to go through. All right, now a little bit, which is interesting, you know, we always think of the American Revolution as kind of a promotion of freedom and democracy, but in many ways, the revolution tended to work against women's rights. I mean, there's a painting of Lydia Chapman Taft. I mean, that's like Howard Cosell would say, listen to that name now because you'll never hear it again. But she supposedly is the first woman to ever be allowed to vote, in her case, in a Massachusetts town hall meeting, instead of her husband who had died. But when Massachusetts created its new constitution during the Revolutionary War, it took voting rights. It specifically took voting rights away from women. And you can see that they lost those rights in other states as well, New York and New Hampshire.
Larry, were you going to share your screen yet?
Isn't it? Am I not?
Shared, right. I don't see it. Try it again.
Well, just a minute. I'm trying to. I'm clicking on the Zoom thing and it's not coming up. So I have to go back out and re-enter?
Maybe. I'm sorry for the interruption, but
yeah,
I had a feeling you thought it was running and it wasn't.
Well, there you guys. Yeah, I guess I'm going to have to do that. Sorry, folks.
Larry, are you trying to share your screen?
What's that?
Are you trying to share your screen?
Yeah.
Okay, did you hit share screen down on the bottom?
I had before, but now it's not there anymore. And then when I click on that little Zoom icon, I see your picture, but I don't really see anywhere to.
Yep, you just turned off your video. So it would be a
Okay.
few slots to the right there. You'll see share screen in green.
Right.
Where you just clicked video.
Okay. I see it's this one right here. Yeah, it was it did have a line through it. Now it no longer does.
Oh, great.
Now it
That's
does.
your, that's your
Now it does
video.
again.
So
So
do you have your PowerPoint open?
mm-hmm.
And then share screen is the green number 1.
Yeah, but see that thing's not there anymore.
Would it have
Oh,
to,
here we go. Now it is. I just didn't do it right. I apologize, folks.
we
I told you
practice, but
be a
sometimes
learning
the best plans.
There
don't
we
work.
go.
Right.
I see it now.
Okay.
It's coming on.
Right. Well, do you still have it? Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. No, I apologize, folks. You know, it's true here under New Jersey. You know, you had to have money to vote. But a married woman's wealth did not count. So basically, women lost the right to vote when, at least in the state of New Jersey, when they got married, because by law, all of a woman's property became literally her husband's, not both. I mean, that's why the legal entity of Mrs. John Smith, she no longer was, Lucy Chapin, as you can see on the left here, that again, the first woman to be able to vote. When she got married, she was literally Mrs. whatever Mr. Taft's name was, which is lost to history, I suppose. But that's how that worked. And that was part of what women were trying to change throughout all the years. Again, there were laws that kept going back and forth. And then notice finally New York in their state constitution in 1777, because they all created new ones during the Revolution, they denied women the right to vote. And as Ms. Blake said, to vote is a man's duty, but it's a woman's crime. Women were literally committing crimes by voting during that time period in those states, which brings up the issue. Voting is a state matter. It is not a national or federal issue. So the amendments that have affected voting throughout the years say that you can create a criteria for voting, but you can't use the fact that a person was because of race, color, or a previous condition of servitude. You can't use the fact that someone is below the age of 21 or below the age of 18, excuse me. You can't use the fact that it's a woman, that they didn't pay a poll tax, but you can use anything else. States control who votes. And that was true from colonial times to the early period under the Articles of Confederation on through to the Constitution. The biggest thing women had to overcome was the attitude towards what their role was in society, which was given the name the cult of true womanhood. What a true woman do? What was she supposed to be? What was her role in society? And basically, it was to take care of the children. It was to run the household, and to be a person who conveyed to her kids and others a sense of moral and religious right and wrong, to protect that family from the outside world. And women were expected to obey their husbands, hence the term obey in the marriage vow, which, if you notice, was not reciprocated by the man. And again, as I mentioned before, they lost their own legal identity. Again, no longer Mrs. John Smith, no longer Lisa Smith, but rather Mr. John Smith. I guess, I don't know if you'd call being able to own slaves a step up or down, but they were able to own their own slaves. As an example, before that, in Virginia, George Washington inherited Martha's slaves upon marriage. They became his. And it's one of the reasons why he was one of the wealthier men in that particular state or colony at the time. Again, things began to change in 1848. 1848 was a big year for the women's movement because you could see New York change some things. And it's also the year of the Seneca Falls Convention, which is right the very next slide. The first convention was called in Seneca Falls in upstate New York in July. So that was, again, that was what, over 170 years ago, basically. And one of the leaders was Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who basically became a lifelong, I mean, she finally died in very early 20th century. She had been involved forever in this movement. She was married, and when they took their vows, the obey was taken out of it for her. She said, I am not going to obey my husband. I am not a lapdog. And therefore, she kind of took one of the early steps, not the only one, but obviously the first one, one of the first steps towards equality with that. The Seneca Falls Convention then produced and that's one of the documents in your on your sheet there. It allowed both men and women, which was considered to be necessary, not just to help spread the appeal, but it was also considered necessary because even some of the women didn't believe they had what it took, the organizational skills to carry this off on their own, since they had never done anything like this. So you can see all the ladies and all the men. And although today we might think that this is pretty middle of the road stuff, you got to realize that in 1848, this was radical. And 1848 was a radical year throughout history, not only in America, but in Europe as well. Oops, I don't need to have that there. But notice they wanted to model what they wrote on the Declaration of Independence. So it says that all men and women, they wanted to make sure the word women was in there, are created equal. And what is history? It's the repeated injuries and usurpation on the part of man toward woman, having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. That's just putting in female specifics to what they said about the King of Great Britain in 1776. So they did that on purpose. Why? Because they realized that this was something that people would recognize. This was a forum that people would be aware of and would say, oh yeah, that makes sense. So that's what they did. And here's a copy of it. And you can see Frederick Douglass's name was up there, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And you can see that line here. I don't know if you can see my arrow or not, but if you can, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. So this will be done. And then they went on, just like the Thomas Jefferson did, they went on to list examples of what men have done to women. And one of them that they mentioned was not being able to vote. I think you have a list in your handout of all the, and I don't think that's all of them, but you can see what kinds of things were on their mind about what they wanted to change by listing the particular evils that were being enforced on women. But as soon as the suffrage movement began with that convention, the women's movement began to split because not everybody agreed on what the absolute goal was. And notice here, one of the first states to begin to consider whether or not to allow women to vote decided that they were going to back Black suffrage, but not female suffrage. And when they voted, as you can see the numbers, so I don't need to repeat those to you, but both attempts to pass suffrage bills for women and for blacks were defeated quite handily, almost 2-1. In fact, more than 2-1 against women. It was actually a little bit closer for blacks. Now, the reason the Republican Party did that is the Republican Party thought that if you tried to include both women and blacks in the same suffrage bill, that it was going to be too easily attacked as being too radical, too much at one time. And therefore, they made the decision to split that particular, those two items off from each other. But as it turned out, neither one of them had much support, as you can tell. And so now women began to think, well, what do we really need to do? But you can see there's some names you might remember, Carrie Chapman Catt, and so on. Now, this is a much later, this is 1994, but it still is, it was from Kansas, so I used it. But notice that's what, 33 or whatever it is. My math isn't that good. Years later, and they still haven't had it. So they're going to have to keep working for it. So you get two different groups that begin to emerge out of this. And one was called the American Equal Rights Association, headed by Lucretia Mott. Mott was an abolitionist. She was a women's rights supporter. She was a believer in education reform. I mean, she was everywhere. She was, and a lot of the women involved in the early part of this movement were Quakers, like she was. That's particularly true for the abolition movement. Those were also Quakers that were involved. And here's Elizabeth, and here we have Susan B. Anthony, who was also involved in the abolitionists. And her great line, somebody asked her once why she didn't get married. And she said, well, because I would become a drudge. And then she said, and then as she was getting near her death, and she was quite old, she was in her 90s, she said, can you imagine, if I had gotten married when I was 25, I'd be a drudge for 70 years. And she was happy not to have been married, and was also very involved in the abolition movement, the temperance movement. She was, the great reform movements of this era that were part of American politics at that time. And then there was also this woman, Lucy Stone, who came to Wisconsin a few times to try to support this movement. This movement had realized the difficulty they were going to have when they were denied the ability to go to the anti-slavery convention in 1840. So eventually they began to realize that this was going to have to start without men, and they did not let a lot of men into their movement in the 1860s. No, it's only lasted a few years. And what's its goal? Equal rights. Now, it doesn't specifically say voting. Equal rights to all citizens, especially the right of suffrage, irrespective of race, color, or sex. But equal rights. And that meant employment, housing, economics, you name it. Equal rights meant across the board. The big thing that comes in too is the 14th and 15th Amendments as well, which were going on in that period right after the Civil War when it came to an end in 1865. The 14th Amendment is what gave citizenship to all people born or naturalized in the United States. But it went on and it used the word men. It didn't include women. Now, women were citizens, but there's nothing in the 14th Amendment that gave women the right to vote. And the 15th Amendment did specifically give Black men the right to vote. It did not include Black women, and it didn't include white women or any women for that matter. And this caused a great a great problem within the women's movement, that some reacted to this by saying, you know, we have to include blacks as a way to get this done. Others said blacks are they're like a lodestone on us. They are dragging us down. The issue of black suffrage is harming the issue of women's suffrage. And that's why the National Women's Suffrage Association, as compared to the American one, it's like the American and National League in baseball, they decided that they were going to oppose the 15th Amendment because it excluded women but gave the vote to black men. So their idea was, if it doesn't give the vote, we're not going to look at this as a stepping stone. That is, by giving black men the right to vote, the next step may be giving white women the right to vote. They didn't look at it that way. They said, we are gonna be opposed to this amendment, keep blacks out of the discussion, and concentrate on white female suffrage. And there's that American Women's Suffrage Association again, that as we mentioned before, and their view basically was, all that did was to sacrifice one form of discrimination, one form of bigotry towards another, to try to get what you want on the backs of others was considered to be wrong. So the National and the American Women Associations kind of operated at on different levels. They pursued different paths and different goals to get what they wanted. And there's a picture of that. Now, again, that doesn't say the year, but you might notice or might recognize Julia Ward Howe was a pretty famous woman at the time. Lucy Stone's name is there. But a lot of women went around the country giving speeches, being heckled, being denied the right to stay in the better hotels, basically because they were considered to be radicals outside of the mainstream, which is what all groups who are seeking access into our system are labeled as, in the beginning. You have to go through that before what at one point becomes radical or is considered radical becomes more mainstream. And that's eventually what happened with the women's movement. Just like black equal rights had to go through that, obviously, as well. And notice one thing that that Lucy Stone and her group did was to support working state by state. That as each state allowed the women to vote, that was an easier task than trying to get Congress and then each state to, and then a 3/4 majority of the states to accept an amendment. That was particularly when you couldn't vote in the first place. You couldn't access that system by voting in people who supported your viewpoint, which was always one of the dangers. Now, some of the wings, this was considered the most radical of the radical wing. I mean, Stone and Stanton were anything but radical, even though that became the argument used against them. And that's an argument that's been used by, think of what were the, what was John Lewis being called in the 1960s when he got on that Freedom bus. He was called a radical because he was seeking rights for blacks, because this was so far out of the mainstream. But Margaret Fuller, way back in 1845, wrote this Women in the 19th Century. And basically she believed is that what took place was that men determined the role of women. Men determined the rules of marriage, and therefore a woman was always, in a sense, being limited. I'm reading the same thing here. I don't want to say that, but It's almost like a woman's character was deformed as a result of that, because she could never express what was really her, which of course varied from woman to woman, and therefore did harm to women. And society was male dominated. But what she said, in I think one of the great lines of her book, she referred to it as the great radical dualism. And that is that maleness and femaleness is not opposite sides of a teeter-totter. It's like, think of it instead as a sliding scale. And some women are more feminine than other women. Some men are more feminine, if you will, than other men. And some men are way more masculine than others. And that the idea is that humans fell within those various parts on that sliding scale. And that, again, if a woman wanted to get a job that wasn't like working in a mill or working in a sewing shop or something, well, she was considered to be a man. She wanted to be a doctor, a lawyer. She wanted to play a sport. Oh, you can't do that because that's going to harm your ability to have children, and all that is one of the great things. And that's why she says in the last line there's no such thing basically as a wholly masculine man or a purely feminine woman. They're in between, and they should be able to seek their own place in society. That is the woman's sphere. It isn't the home. It's whatever she makes good. That is, could it be the home? Yes. The law, industry, the school, the stage, business, the arts. What were actresses at this time considered? They were basically considered to be nothing more than prostitutes. So these were all things that women aspired to, based on the idea that it was up to women to decide, not a male-dominated society. Now you can agree with that or disagree. That's up to you. That was her view of how things worked. And then there was a woman named Charlotte Gilman, who wrote The Yellow Wallpaper and Women in Economics, as you can see there on the lower left. And this was still, she wrote this book in an era still where women, when they got pregnant, were confined. And that room and that wallpaper became a symbol, not just of the confinement of the woman during her pregnancy, but the room and the wallpaper became the limits on what women could hope to achieve in society. And what they wanted was how to interact with people. They needed to widen their role, to widen their opportunities, to widen their perspective, to, again, as I mentioned before, to choose their own path, as we all have done, I think. I don't know, maybe not, but we're indebted to people who argued that. She came up with this term, I think, too, it's a great one, the Cupid in the kitchen syndrome. And that was the idea that what men wanted was a woman who would take care of the house, take care of the children, and then take care of the men at night. And that's why radicals of the 60s basically began, I'm talking, now the 1960s, even beyond, Gloria Steinem argued that all, that women basically were prostitutes, married women were prostitutes, but they got paid in the form of housing and food. Now, again, that was considered radical at that time. Charlotte Gilman didn't quite go that far, but she was heading in that direction. And again, they lived in a society in which men determined what women could do rather than women determining what women could do. And that was part of the problem that Charlotte Gilman tried to emphasize. Now, these were not, Women in Economics was more of a sociology book, but Yellow Wallpaper was fiction. So but it was used as the method to get her point across. But there's Charlotte Gilman at the turn of the century there. The other thing that was also rising at that time was the so-called free love movement. Now, when I taught high school, when I used the term free love, all the sleeping kids woke up because they wanted to know what I was talking about. And then I had to disappoint them by saying it wasn't about sex. It was about marriage, having a choice in who one married, having a choice in whether or not sex led to having children, and who their sexual partners were gonna be. And these two sisters, Victoria Woodhull and Tennessee Claflin, in fact, the name got combined, so it was actually ended up being spelt like the state of Tennessee, but Tennessee Claflin, they were big believers in the free love movement, because to them, what that meant was women taking control of their own lives. And very early, I mean, way back in the 1870s, if a woman got married and pregnant, she was no longer in control of her own life. That's the way they viewed it. So, I mean, they noticed they opened a Wall Street brokerage firm. They were the first one to issue a to show or to publish the Communist Manifesto, which was also written in 1848. That's another thing. And the Communist Manifesto is, one of the great pieces of propaganda in history. Again, whether you agree with its conclusions is a whole nother story. Its influence was kind of big. So they also opened up their own newspaper, as you can see here, and they were able to have an influence that went beyond just a few blocks. They were able to get this out, and people read it. It was in New York. It had a readership that was influential. Now, notice how this is attacked. See, and this is what some of the more mainstream women were afraid of. That you come out with this free love idea, and what do you get? You give people another reason to oppose suffrage for women. They don't need them, but it's always good to have them. So, in other words, all the women who wanted the right to vote were also advocates of free love, which of course they weren't, because you can't make a claim about a gender that all of them want the same thing or think the same way. And notice how they read this. I mean, they want to abolish Christian marriage and introduce what is called free love. It abolishes wifehood, and for the wife, it substitutes the mistress and makes the end of the relation sensual pleasure. Can't say the word sexual, but it was sensual pleasure. And they printed this, and you can see this picture here. And what it's saying is that really what free love advocates were women who wanted to have sex with other women. Again, missing the point, but it was used as a way to attack this right to vote that women were seeking. Now, Kate Chopin, I think, who some have read, I know Laura was telling me that she read her when she was in college. Basically says, there's other things for women besides getting married. And the idea that somehow women didn't enjoy sex, that women didn't need to enjoy sex because the only purpose of sex was to procreate. And therefore, she wrote a bunch of novels, two of which were The Awakening and The Story of an Hour. And one of them was about The Awakening, is about a woman having an affair, a married woman having an affair. And that book was actually banned in many libraries for years. As considered to be too risque, too immoral, too damaging to social standards and morals. But this next one is interesting too. In the story of an hour, she wrote, I mean, if you read that quote there, her husband had died, a woman who had been married for quite a long time. That's what she knew. She had been married young and had lived a long life with her husband. But, and notice what she says. She knew that she would weep again when she saw the kind, tender hands folded in death. But she saw beyond that bitter moment, a long procession of years to come that would belong to her absolutely. And she opened and spread her arms out to them in welcome. In other words, in this fiction, a woman was liberated by the fact that she no longer was connected to her husband. And it seems perhaps cold, but it doesn't change necessarily the way people looked at it. I don't know if anybody out there is a MASH fan, but there is that episode where Margaret gets divorced and decides that she is going to be her own person. And the connection to this is like, I'm not going to worry about what, trying to please men or what men want. It's what Margaret wants. And in a sense, that's where the story of an hour was coming from as well. You can always find a lot of great cultural things in MASH, no question about that. But here's the public feminists. They weren't as worried about voting rights as they were about other factors. And this is Elizabeth Cady Stanton, much older. A lot of the daguerreotype came out in the 1840s. So lots of women, particularly anybody who wasn't wealthy, would not really have a picture of them if they were young in that era. We did see one of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, but lots of other women never would have had their picture taken at that point. But here she is, a much older woman, that matron look on her face, but still sharp as a tack, still attuned completely to the women's movement and the need for women to figure out what was going on. And she wrote something in 1892, which again, I provide for you. That probably more than anything else accounts for the length of the document that you could read, called The Solitude of Self. And basically this is it's a plea to women that they have to be able to take care of themselves. And she says, there is a marriage, men and women in marriage are in a rowboat, and maybe the man is rowing the boat. He's making the decisions, he's earning the money, but what happens when the man dies? What does she do if she's never had that experience? And so women needed to explore for themselves. They need to be able to have the ability, the social ability, not necessarily just the legal ability, but the idea that society would accept women who sought to work outside of the home, who went to school and got an education, who were independent, because they would have to row that boat by themselves at some point, and they better have the skills that would be necessary. I can use an example in my own life. My mother, Lucille, my dad died at a relatively young age of 55 in 1972, and my mother had worked during World War II in San Antonio, but since then, since they got married in 45, she didn't work. She didn't take care of the finances. She didn't have a driver's license during any of that time. Now, all of a sudden, here's my ma, and my dad went quickly of cancer. Here's my ma in that rowboat saying, well, how do you make these oars work? And it's something that she had to learn, but she did. She got a job. She got a driver's license. She joined a couple of women's associations that got her into a social life separate from anybody that she knew when she was married, and she was able to help herself, and that's what Elizabeth Cady Stanton was arguing that all women needed to be able to do that. That was just part of your responsibility to be able to take care of oneself. And we all say that as a society. I think we just mean it in a different way. Is that we need to take care of ourselves, earn our own living, but everyone needs to do that. That's her point of view. But again, de-emphasizing the right to vote, because the vote's not necessarily going to give you anything all by itself. Then there were what were called the domestic feminists, Stowe. What these did was to emphasize, was to take that cult of true womanhood and use it as a way to promote the right to vote, because if women were going to be the ones that purveyed morals to children, if they were supposed to be the moral leaders of society, then they had to be able to express that through voting. And just as a woman might have a role in how the family was run, they should also have a role in how society was run. And one of the ways in which that could be seen was advocacy for safe food and safe drugs for their children, made, at least the food side made famous in, now all of a sudden my brain is gone, the book on the meatpacking plant in Chicago by Upton Sinclair. Again, I'm not, it's not coming to my brain all this, but doesn't matter. A great book, particularly this section on what was going on in the meatpacking plant. Maybe somebody can remember, they can raise their hand and we'll get that answer. I just can't think of it right now. And again, they got, and it did happen. Luckily, Teddy Roosevelt read that book and joined with women to move for legislation, the Pure Food and Drug Act, which is still around today. But at any rate, that was their way. So their way was not to say we're going to just reject the role of women. We are going to use the traditional role of women to argue for the vote, because that way we won't be as radicalized. We will seem like we are simply extending the role of women rather than creating a new one that threatened the status quo of society. So it's and it's an interesting way to look at it. I think it's it's kind of my theory about political movements in general, is that once women or whoever is promoting a thing can begin to appeal to people, that what they're asking for is not really something new, but rather something that is a glaring weakness or a glaring absence, and something that we already agree exists and should exist, that's when changes are made. So that's where this group of women were coming from at any rate. Now, the most conservative wing was the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which was led, as you can see, by Frances Willard. And the Women's Christian Temperance Union was, its main goal was to get suffrage, to get prohibition passed. They were relatively successful in some places. 1850, Maine passed a law called, quite simply, the Maine Law, as it's known in history anyway, that basically made it illegal to purchase or to manufacture alcohol. And that was what they stuck with. They were very reluctant to move into the area of suffrage. Okay, so because, and partly one explanation is their background. Women from, notice the name, the Women's Christian Temperance Union or movement. It should say union. I look at that 1,000 times. It says movement and not union. WCTU. It was made up of white evangelical Protestants, some of the most conservative religious elements in the country. It was more southern than it was northern. But basically, as one historian described it, these were women whose lives were basically the home and the church. That was the two parts that they were involved in. And they used that position in the church and in the home to promote temperance. And that if they read the Bible, people who read the Bible as they did, they believed that there was evidence in the Bible that supported this so-called dominant, subordinate, male-female relationship. The men were dominant, the females were subordinate. But that one way to begin to bring men under some control is to enact temperance and prevent money being wasted on alcohol, or the guy losing his job or spending all the money, coming home drunk and kicking the dog and beating the wife. That was always that they thought that would happen. But slowly, and I guess this is what leadership is about, slowly Willard began to see the connection between prohibition and suffrage. That if women were truly going to play their role in society, one of which was to work towards the ending of the consumption of alcohol, a way to do that would be to gain the right to vote. And this was a great moment for her. To come to, notice on the bottom below her picture there, to come to consciousness is evermore to come to power. That consciousness awakening moment is what gets women to realize that there's something else. She had it. Marx, I mentioned the Communist Manifesto in Das Kapital, he referred to the, there is this sense of like false class identification, that in a sense what he was really saying in modern terms is that the working class identified with the upper class instead of identifying with the lower class. And what that was wrong, because that would keep them in that dominant position. And women who in a sense accepted this dominant male role would forever be in that position. So you have to become conscious that there is another way. And that was a big part of me. If you think about the 60s, a lot of talk about a new consciousness. I'm talking about the 1960s again, excuse me. A new consciousness, that you have to raise consciousness in people, first of all, to get them to accept that there's a problem and to see what the solution might be. And therefore, they began to work for that. And women began to read the Bible a little bit more. And now they found that is women of the Temperance Union began to see passages that maybe did call not so much for male dominance and women activism. And they came up with this idea of home protection, that the reason women should have the vote is to protect the home. So they're like the group before them and others. But, the ballot was going to change things. I mean, think of when the Voting Rights Act in 1965 was passed under Lyndon Johnson's presidency. I mean, he constantly talked about how the vote was going to be it's a palliative, it's a cure-all. That without the vote, you're never going to get anywhere in society. And that's where Willard and her group began to see things. I mean, I love this line: paper ballot began to fall as silently as snowflakes upon the sod, but executes the freeman's will as lightning do the will of God. And by 1883, I got to stop moving that, I apologize. By 1883, and then finally, really in 1894, they came unequivocally to the view that women are wronged if they don't have the right to vote. So you got all these groups that are beginning to move and to coalesce around various ways to attack the this idea that they can't vote. My personal view is that it was this argument used by the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the one here used by the domestic feminist and some others that were more responsible for getting women the right to vote than were certainly groups like the Free Love Movement, but even in others that talked about how you got to have social change. That's hard for people to get their hands around. But again, that's an opinion. It's not necessarily. And there we go. Women bring all the voters into the world, so women should be able to vote. They have an important role to play in society, and voting is a way to express that. Well, one of the tactics that they began to, we'll take a break in about 5 minutes here. One of the tactics they began to use was civil disobedience, centered around a refusal to pay taxes. Because what they argued was the revolutionary phrase of no taxation without representation. If we can't vote, we can't be taxed either. And that's going to take on a special aura when the income tax amendment is passed in the 19-teens, the 16th Amendment that created an income tax for the first time in American history. Shall not all women refuse to pay their taxes? She said, yeah. In fact, notice she's reaching back to the old revolutionary heroes. That taxation without representation is just. Shall we deny what they said? The answer was no. At least in the minds of them, it was. But men began the argument, and this goes back to colonial times too, by the way, that women were in fact represented. Even though they couldn't vote, their husband who could represented their interests and of their daughters. So the one vote in the family is what represented mom and the 3 daughters as well. But that was rejected. You can't represent multiple interests. It assumes that everyone has the same, that the interest of a woman on a particular issue is the same as another, as her husband's. I don't know about you guys, but I know in mine that was not the case. I do recall my mother, before she was alone in that boat, making my dad sleep alone on the couch when he tried to tell her who to vote for in 1960. He was adamant that she vote for Nixon. She chose John F. Kennedy instead. And that, I remember a big argument about that and him sleeping on the couch. So he did not represent her interests. That was the other one. And what they said is, this is the British argument of virtual representation. Even though the colonists, let's say a merchant in New England who couldn't vote in the parliament was represented by an English merchant who could vote for parliament. And merchants had the same interest by virtue of being merchants. And that's not true. First of all, because they were in different locations, they had different issues to deal with. And of course, they didn't all think the same anyway. I mean, that's true. That would be like trying to say that all teachers, because they are teachers, all vote the same way. No, they don't. Or doctors, or men, or any other group. So that was part of it. So what happened was that there began to be this movement that they should not. So because women pay taxes and because women obey the laws, they should be able to vote, which is why vote yes on amendment number 1. Now, this was in 1912. There were lots of state referenda in 1912 throughout the country to try to gain the right to vote for women in those various states. A lot of them failed, as we'll see, particularly one in Wisconsin. But and then again, as I said, the 16th Amendment really kind of, in a sense, kind of really drove home this need to vote, because for the first time, there was a direct tax upon all citizens, including women. And Carrie Chapman Catt, who was born in Ripon, you know, the birthplace of the Republican Party that first opposed the extension of slavery in the country, was adamant that this had to be done. It says that by doing so, Congress has violated the most fundamental and sacred principle of our government, since it provides no compensating representation for the tax it imposes. So either you got to exempt women from the income tax, or you got to give them the right to vote, one or the other. But you can't tax them and not let them vote at the same time. That is a denial of the most basic political and economic premise in American society. It's just in our culture, the way we think politically and socially. But there she was. And you can see Carrie Burnham here, another one. Resistance to tyranny is obedience to God, she proclaims on her banner. And she said, I have a right to decide who I'm going to pay my taxes to, or what my taxes are going to be used for. Although the court has rejected that argument that citizens who try to sue against the use of tax dollars for a particular purpose have always lost. But again, to right to choose who the people are making the decisions, that's what he is talking about. All right, we're going to take a 5-minute break right here. I'm going to see where we're at and adjust, because I don't have page numbers here. So we're going to take a little bit of a break, and I'll come back in 5 minutes. In fact, I'll come back as soon as I'm done doing what I'm doing. But okay.
Okay, and if I guess we have one question earlier that was, is Tenny Claflin related to Increase Claflin? And I did a quick search on that and could not find any information. I'm not sure if anyone has an answer to that quickly, but one place we could check is ancestry.com to see if there's an answer to that. But it didn't pop out as an answer in Google, so I'm guessing maybe not.
Yeah. Oh, no. Well, I don't know, maybe way back. These are Southern girls.
Yeah, distant relationship.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, we're all related, like, to every 6 people around us, so it's possible. Well, it says he was in New Orleans, but I don't think there's any.
But were you indicating that she and Victoria Woodhull were sisters?
Yes.
They were.
I think so.
Yeah. And didn't Victoria Woodhull run for president?
Yes, I got that in here, yeah.
Yeah.
Although that might be a slide that has to go if I got to get rid of one.
I remember a really good book on that subject in the library. I don't know if it's still here, but a biography of Victoria Woodhull.
Larry, if you select your start video where it has a line through it, that will share the video screen of you and your face right now too, if you'd like.
Okay. Like right here, you mean?
There you go.
Perfect.
Now I can. All right, there we go. All right. Thank you.
Oh, we have to do that again, Larry, so that it just went off again. So if there's a line, we can't see you.
Oh, I think I can get it done this way. I'm about halfway through. So I don't think that would be a
While
problem.
he's working, can I make a little announcement about the parade next week?
Yes, that's a good idea.
Commercial?
I did read about it. So let us know what's going on.
Well, I'm Pat Szynski. I'm the current chair of the League of Women Voters. And while today, the 18th, is the day that the last state, Tennessee, ratified the 19th Amendment, August 26th is called Women's Equality Day because that's the day after all the states ratified, then it was taken and certified to be law. And after the 26th, women could legally vote then. So the 18th is the last date to ratify, and then the 26th is Women's Equality Day. And that was thought up by, oh shoot, I was going to say Bella Abzug, but I don't think that's right. Anyway, it was in the 70s that they labeled it. So in order to celebrate, and because of COVID, we had the league had planned to do all kinds of fun stuff this year for the 100th anniversary of the women's right to vote. It's the 100th anniversary of the League of Women Voters, which was formed when women got the vote so that they could learn how to vote. And we've always been teaching and educating about voting and issues to vote about. But we decided we wanted something to celebrate. So we're going to have a car parade, and anybody can join if you like. I'm getting a little nervous with it might get big. There will be some press in the paper next week, but basically you can decorate your car if you like, but you don't have to. And we're going to line up at 3rd and Jefferson going north, like line up in front of Bay Ship, whoever comes. And then travel down 3rd Street, go over the Michigan Street Bridge, go up around by the West Side School, turn around, come back on the new bridge, end up at Martin Park, and then at the end, and we're going to be hooping and hollering all the way, because this is what they did in 1920. All the church bells in all the towns rang, and we're going to get some church bells here ringing. The clock tower bell will be ringing, and then when we get back to Martin Park at the end, I will read the amendment. We're going to hand out flyers so everybody can read it together from their cars, because we're trying to be as COVID friendly as possible. And that'll be it. It's mainly about the parade and the bells ringing and celebrating the 100 years. And Lord knows we need something to celebrate these days. So we thought this would be a fun thing to do. If you're free that day, we'll be lining up around 11:30, the 26th, which is a week from tomorrow. The parade will start right at noon when the bells start ringing. So anyway, that's my commercial, and thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And there is a note saying that Increase Claflin had a granddaughter who ran for president, which would have been Victoria.
Oh, there you go. So they are related.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
All right, what do I got? See, now I got the thing open, but I still can't get back to Morgan.
Yes, for sharing the screen.
Confused again. How do I get back to getting my PowerPoint up where it says?
So you'll click the green button again that says share screen.
Yeah, right. But
and then you'll see your PowerPoint.
I don't have it here. When the little video thing icon is not selected anymore. So, but I'm on the wrong thing again or something. How do I?
Okay, so if you go into Zoom, so if you click the little blue with the white camera image, and then open up your Zoom meeting where you see all of us.
Right, but I thought that's what I was doing. Well, get rid of that. I mean, I got Zoom up on my screen. Well, this is confusing.
So you're in it now because you're turning on and off your video camera. So to the left of the video camera, you will see a green button that says share screen.
Ah, there we go.
Great.
Oh, I'm back.
Okay.
Well, we're ready to go back again. Is that all right?
Yes.
Okay. Now, Laura looked this up. I want to take no credit. I know someone had a question about whether the Tennessee Claflin was related to the Claflin from Door County, and the answer is yes. It was his his granddaughter, because she found, as she
No,
always
Rennie and Dave,
useful information that says that he was the granddaughter of Victoria Woodhull, so they had to be.
Rennie and Dave Lee came up with that answer.
So they are related. So good family. Well, this is just a little plug from my book. You can see the cover on the left, The Captured, the Sick, and the Dead. And this just gives you a little, this is something the publisher wrote about it. And down on the bottom, you can see the address for the publisher. If you pre-order it before, I would say, September 1st, I get a little friendlier cut. And then she will deliver it to you in the mail. Or if I know you, well, that's just the best way to do it, no matter what. Because otherwise I get too involved trying to figure out who gets a book from me. But if you consider it, again, you can go on that sandbeachpress.com and you can read more about it. And she also sells children's books, writes and sells children's books that you might be interested in those as well, for grandkids and such. But anyway, I hope you consider the idea of buying it. I would be honored. All right, with that, we will move on. And this is, I think, is where we were. Two women, Julia and Abby Smith of Connecticut, you can see pictured here, they wouldn't pay their property taxes as a protest against, since they didn't have a say in being able to determine how their property taxes were spent, or who made the decision. They refused to pay their taxes, and they basically were a sheriff's sale, as we might call it today, came, and their cows were sold to pay for those taxes. There was also a woman from Wisconsin, J.S. Whedon from Viroqua, who didn't pay her taxes for 6 years, and finally the long arm of the government caught up with her, and she had to pay both tax and they basically sentenced her. Now another great one is Anna Shaw, a doctor, and I like what her attitude is. You may pick my pocket, but I'm not going to just give you the money. I'm not going to turn my pockets wrong side out so you can take my money out of it. You're going to have to do that. And I love this line. When she said she was going to be fined that kind of money, she said, well, I won't pay the fine. Well, then you're going to be sent to jail. Well, okay, I'll go to jail. And then they asked her if she was going to go on a hunger strike, and she said, most assuredly, no. Because that was a big thing at that time for women when they got jailed for this, to go on hunger strikes, in some cases to be forcibly fed. But she said, no, I'm eating. So I know that would win the hearts of many, refusing to give up food. So I get a kick out of that. But she did go to jail, and she did eat. Sure. Now, Susan B. Anthony was basically what Anthony began to argue was that citizenship, that is the 14th Amendment, if you were born or naturalized in the United States, you automatically had the right to vote. And that it certainly gave both men and women the right to vote. But, to be honest, the court's going to reject that argument. And historically, that's never been the case, because back in colonial times, and even through, like until 1843, you had to pay taxes in order to vote. Some states you had to be a certain religion in order to vote or to hold office. It has always been up to the states to determine voting rights. It's not, although I think many wish it were, it is not a right necessarily protected specifically in the Constitution. So you can deny the right to certain people, like those who are in jail, those who are below the age of 18, those who may be mentally infirm. All those are reasons that states can use to deny the right to vote. That's always been the case. But what she did, what she did was she actually voted in 1872 in the presidential election in Indiana, and was put on trial for voting. Again, a man's right is a woman's crime. She was found guilty, but the judge did not let it go to the jury because he was afraid that the judge was concerned that the jury would just say, well, forget it, we're not going to find her guilty of that. So he, in a sense, found her guilty, but then said the fine of $100 will not be collected because that way you can't make an appeal.
Larry,
Yes.
in your poster, it says 2002. Was this a play that they put on?
Yeah, must have been.
Yeah.
Yeah, I should have just. Yeah, that must have just been the thing, right? You know what? I never even noticed that ever. Funny how you miss a lot, even though you look at it 1,000 times. So somebody else saw it right away. Very good. Yeah, it had to be a play. Because it says 1870s dress encouraged down there on the bottom. So I could have lied and just put a little text box over there and put a different date in, but I didn't, again, because I didn't notice. I'm not going to lie about it. But anyway, the point is she got found guilty. Now, interestingly, today, President Trump pardoned Susan B. Anthony as a way of, well, I don't know, somebody else can characterize his intentions. But at any rate, she no longer is a convicted, I got to believe it was not a felony. But she is no longer a person convicted of a crime. She has been pardoned. So that was wiped away. The more important case involved this woman, Virginia Minor, who lived in Missouri and who also filed against the state when she was denied the right to register to vote. So she took the state to court. And this one reached all the way up through to the Supreme Court of the United States, not just the Supreme Court of Missouri. And basically notice at the bottom, I think you can read it there, that suffrage was a state matter. It was the only limit on the state action was the 15th Amendment, which said you couldn't deny the right to vote because of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And this is still the wording that applies, that voting is not an inherent right of citizenship, which is interesting, to say the least. It is, one would think that perhaps being a citizen would give someone a right to vote, but I guess what they're saying is that if you follow that through its logical extension, then a baby should be able to vote because they are born in the United States and are citizens. But again, the only limits are, paying poll taxes and being below the age of 18. So again, all the amendments do, including the 19th, is to state what are criteria the states cannot use. They can use any other criteria they want. That you have to have a photo ID. That you have to stand on your head in the corner. That you can't vote by mail. That you can vote by mail. Because that's what the Supreme Court said the Constitution meant. So that was Minor versus Happerstead. That was a major thing. So that's why, by the way, the extension of this decision, notice that date. This is basically the date, not, after Reconstruction came to an end, supposedly with the election of 1876, that states began to pass Jim Crow laws. So now they can't deny a black man the right to vote because he is black, or because of the color of his skin, or because he was once a slave, but you can because of a failure of a test. Or other factors, that they didn't pay a poll tax. So what this did was to open the door, so to speak, to states taking action to keep blacks from voting that did not fit race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And this is what had to be overcome by the Voting Rights Act. and the Civil Rights Act to allow to get rid of that. But now the all those things are made illegal. There's no poll taxes, and the Civil Rights Act made, in fact, the Voting Rights Act made almost all limits on Black voting rights to be illegal, and needed, if you remember, Justice Department okay to make any changes in voting procedures until a few years ago when the Roberts Court struck down that portion of the Voting Rights Act as unconstitutional, which is, again, seems like some people don't really think voting is important. Oh, I don't know. That's not what my civics class said, but I guess it's what reality says. All right, now where was the opposition to women's suffrage? Because there was a lot. One is that you're going to destroy the family. You take women out of the home, you let them vote, you change their role. Women are not going to be the caretakers of the children. Children are going to be left unsupervised. They're not going to be given the moral education that they require. And that women would become so headstrong that they would dare to disobey their husbands. And there's one argument that basically said that a woman who opposed her husband politically was committing adultery. Well, I guess that's what my mother was doing when my dad slept on the couch. She was committing adultery because she would dare to say, I'm going to do what I think is right, not what you think is right. What a concept. Now, one argument, as you can see, was either, okay, you give a wife, because everything is based around the wife, like a unmarried woman did not really seem to fit into this. A woman who wasn't a mother did not seem to fit in this. But he said, you give the man a vote and you give the woman a vote. So either you got two votes for the same thing, which, and everybody does that. It doesn't change the results, or they simply counter each other and you don't have any impact either. So it's an interesting argument. And then what's going to happen? You're going to have all kinds of dissension in families because women are going to insist on being able to vote the way they want. But also it's this kind of mathematical argument that, either they vote for the same thing or they split their vote, and either way, it doesn't really change the results. I don't know. That would be true if like the same number of men and women voted and they were all married and they all voted one of those two ways. But given the fact that women make up by a good margin now, a majority of the electorate in the United States today, that wouldn't work. So where's the woman's place? It's in the home. And that women had power in the home because of this, and they should stick with that. And that society operated best when women were in charge of the home and men were in charge of the outside world. Again, you can make your own decisions on that. Now, another one was the women who were, again, Amelia Bloomer always gets the credit, but actually the first woman to wear what become known as bloomers, as you can see there, the pantaloons, as they were called, was actually Elizabeth Smith Miller, who's pictured here. But it was Bloomer who made them more popular by publicizing it. And but again, Stanton, see, this is a little bit of the conservative side, said no, all these are doing is radicalizing the approach to getting women the right to vote, because now women want to wear the pants. Now, again, you don't have to agree with that. I don't think that's at all the way what was intended, but it's the way things are perceived. And again, what an opposition group can use as an argument. So women who want to vote really just want to be men who want to wear the pants, literally, figuratively, in the family and in society, for that matter. Now, the biggest source of opposition came from the liquor interest, and that was because of the fear of the Women's Christian Temperance Union and some studies of the time that showed that that where the right to vote got passed in a state, there was a stronger, for women that is, obviously, there was a stronger appeal for prohibition in that state. Because, you know, again, states could on their own ban alcohol. But so the interest, the liquor interest, very strong in the state of Wisconsin as well, opposed the right to vote because for women, because they believed it would lead to prohibition in the state. And Wisconsin opposed prohibition. I think we were either the last or second last state to, in fact, I don't even know. Let me take that back. I'm thinking of something else. Wisconsin never did ratify the amendment that created prohibition. You know, and then there's this thing that, you know, the way women kind of portrayed, you know, hands, which had just set aside the beer mug, the decanter, and the greasy pack of cards, are casting ballots. But hands familiar, that is women's hands, familiar with the pages of the Book of God, are the ones who can save the state, which is why they ought to be able to vote. And you can see some of the big interests there, the National Brewers Congress, the National Retail Liquor Dealers Association. Those were, again, all opposed to giving women the right to vote because of the impact. And notice what in Michigan, they had a rough suffrage amendment, and it said every wet newspaper in the state opposed equal suffrage. That is, those who were opposed to prohibition were also opposed to women's suffrage. And that's the same with every politician who did that. And then everyone who were dries did the same on the opposite side. That is that prohibition and women's suffrage were uniquely tied together. And that to be for one position, you know, to be for suffrage was to be in favor of prohibition, and the opposite was true. So that's part of how that worked. But there were successes, early successes. In 1869, Wyoming Territory became the first political unit, the first geopolitical unit in the country to grant women the right to vote. That was, and notice the first one was in 1870. Louisa Ann Swain was the first woman to vote. Whether this picture was from 1870, I have no idea. But she voted, the first one to vote in a general election, that is an election for House members and perhaps a Senate member. No, because they went into that for territory. This was for territorial representation because they weren't a state yet. But notice too, when they basically said in 1890, when they applied to become a state, did Wyoming, that if you're not going to grant, if we can't have women being allowed to vote, then we don't want to be in the union. We'd rather be out of the country for another 100 years and deny women the right to vote. And Congress, which controls whether or not states are allowed into the union or not, voted in favor of that. So Wyoming came in 1890. In Colorado, you can see it was 1893. And in Utah, it was 1896. But there was a little trouble in Utah because basically Congress said to Utah, until you ban polygamy, you're not coming into the country. You're not coming into the union with or without women being able to vote. And when they finally did Utah remove or make polygamy illegal, Utah came into the union and women were allowed to vote. So there were that. And then you can see Idaho came in here. Now notice it's all Western states. One reason is, and this kind of can show it, a guy did a study, some historian did a study, and basically what he said was that the three factors that tended to work towards women's suffrage was the level of party competition. That is, if a state tended to be one party, and the South in particular back in those days was one party Democrat. Republicans in those southern states, as I'll say, John Tower in 1980 was the first Republican elected to the Senate in Texas. Shelby in Alabama was about the same time. In fact, he actually became a Republican. I mean, basically the idea that in these southern states, it was Democrats. I mean, the person who won the primary was the one who got elected in the fall. There was no Republican Party. It was just wings of the Democratic Party. And that's why you notice how much of the South is either black completely, which means if you look down here, no suffrage at all. Or in the case of Wisconsin, you have to look over here. They kind of moved it, so it's hard to see. School bond or tax, that's all Wisconsin could vote on by 1917. Could not vote for members of the House. It could not vote for governor. It could not vote for the president, members of Congress, mayor, whoever. The other one was low female populations. The lower the female population, the more likely to grant suffrage. Now, why would that be? It was to attract women, because a lot of these Western states got opened up in the search for gold. I mean, Nevada was the silver state, which came into the Union during the Civil War. Montana, none of these are the dates when they became a state. It's when they granted women the right to vote. A lot of these are these centennial states. In 1876, a whole host of these Western states, but they were doing that as a way to get women to come out, because money was made by mining, and it attracted miners, it attracted businessmen who would want to try to make a living off of what miners and mining companies needed. But women were not in great supply, so they thought, well, what's a way to get women to come is give them a right to vote, which they wouldn't have necessarily back in their home state. And you can see in 1917, I'm just going to make sure I got this right. I believe I do. Only one state in the Union had complete suffrage for women. That was in 1917. That was the state of New York, right here. Now you could say Kansas. I don't know if Kansas is Western or not, but in 1912, even ahead of New York, they overcame that opposition from 1867, and they passed full suffrage. Arkansas here was the first Southern state to grant some kind of suffrage in 1917, that they could vote in primary elections. But again, those are party elections, not national elections. So you can see overwhelmingly the right to vote was a Western phenomenon. Again, why? A higher percentage of rural populations. The California of 1911 is not the California of 2020. These were rural. I mean, today, I don't know, Montana still basically has what I think about 900,000 people. That's maybe 100,000 more than Milwaukee County. The other one was a small black population. The smaller the black population, the more likely to support women's right to vote. So that's why these states had these characteristics. Wisconsin had really, starting around 1900, did not have a lot of party competition. The Republican Party becomes the dominant party of the state of Wisconsin. In fact, Bill Proxmire, in 1958, when he replaced McCarthy as senator, was the first Democratic senator of the 20th century. And Gaylord Nelson, when he was elected senator in 1960, was the first Democrat elected to that position in the 20th century. So Wisconsin was a one-party Republican party. So these again are some factors. Obviously, there are variations on a theme, but that's still that's part of the deal on why these some of these states were very active. Let's take a state like Alabama. They wanted to make sure that giving women the right to vote did not become a avenue by which blacks were going to be given the right to vote in their state. So a lot of opposition, you could see. Took a long time, the long and winding road. Now, Wisconsin, some put the date of the suffrage movement in Wisconsin in 1853, when Clarina Nicholson and Lydia Fowler came and gave speeches in favor of it in 1853, and then Lucy Stone came to Wisconsin in 1855. In 1856, there was introduced a bill to give women the right to vote. And femme covert and femme sole means married women and unmarried women. But that was rejected, never got out of committee, and died, and was not introduced again for a while. In 67, the legislature approved a state constitutional amendment. But the way our amendment process works in this state is the same wording has to be passed at 3 different sessions in fact, they have to be in a row, 3 in a row sessions of the legislature, and then it goes in front of the people in a referendum to vote up or down. And because this 1867 one did not get past the next legislative session, it too died. So now Wisconsin women begin to mobilize, and you can see they have the Wisconsin Suffrage Association, and it held its first meeting in 1869, and Laura Ross Walcott of Milwaukee was elected to be the first president of an organization committed to gaining the right to vote for women. And you can see a little pamphlet they put out. Excuse me, I was trying to get over there, but by the Suffrage Association in Waukesha, they're trying to say who's in favor of it. Well, the State Teachers Association, the Federation of Labor, women's clubs, the Ladies of the Maccabees. I was going to look that up, but I never did. The Grange, the Farmers Organization, Farmers Society of Equity, ministers, the WCTU, all these groups in favor of giving women the right to vote. And who's opposed? Those that are involved in the liquor industry, saloon keepers and breweries and liquor dealers and stores. So that's what they were trying to overcome in trying to get this passed. Now, one of the leaders, and this shows kind of more the conservative side in the state. In fact, today we'd look at this and say, at least many would say, where is she coming from? But it was Olympia Brown. She moved to Racine, my hometown, in 1878, and became a pastor at a church there. But her view of women's right or women's suffrage was to separate it from any attempt to give all males, including blacks, the right to vote. In fact, a lot of her speeches exhibited elements of both, you'd call it xenophobia and negrophobia. That, and as she put it, you give the right to vote to any ignorant, greasy slob from Ireland. I'm Irish, so I say that. And you give it to blacks who couldn't spell their name if their life depended on it. I mean, I'm paraphrasing what she said here, but you'll give it to them, but you won't give it to educated women. You won't give it to mothers. but you'll give it to like some of the worst elements of society simply because they are men. And that appealed to some, but kind of divided a lot of women too, that they would place such an emphasis, that she would anyway, that she would place such an emphasis on instead of trying to get everybody in the same tent, she wanted to kick some out of the tent. So she supported an amendment, but basically to give the right to vote to native-born Americans, not immigrants. But, second-generation immigrants, somebody who was the child who was born in the United States to an immigrant in the United States would then be able to vote. It's just that first group that was left out. But eventually, leadership passed to this woman, Theodora Yeomans. And I use the word coup because there was like an organized attempt to have Brown removed from her position. And she allied herself with the Cat Wing, Carrie Chapman Cat Wing, on the National American Women's Suffrage Association after another referendum in Wisconsin was defeated in 1917. So now we're going to work with this national organization to get the vote in Wisconsin. Another big women's rights activist in the state of Wisconsin was Juliet Severance. I don't know if these are names you ever heard of before. I'll admit, when I was doing research for this, there were, I hadn't. It shows how this element of the suffrage movement kind of gets ignored. Everything concentrates on the national element, but not necessarily on what was going on in our own state. And being from Wisconsin, I think that's important. Women are slaves. They're owned by men, body and soul. And Severance says you got to obey the principles of your own soul. And a woman's happiness, her health, her future depended on a marriage. And that's wrong. That's why she's at least got to have a role in deciding who she's going to get married to. That romantic love should become the basis of marriage rather than choices made on economic or social or other concerns by one's parents. She was one of them who said that basically a married woman sells her body as a prostitute does. And that was wrong. Women have to become independent, be able to take care of themselves. And notice a little difference here, though, too, on the bottom, which unfortunately is covered up a little bit. But she's saying it's not just the right to vote that's going to make a difference. You have to change people's hearts and minds. It's important that women be able to vote, but you still have to change men's attitudes towards women. And in fact, you got to change some women's attitudes towards women. Those women who believe that women didn't really deserve the right to vote, who didn't really believe that if women began a role outside of the home, that society would go to hell in a handbasket. That needs to be changed. That's where this consciousness thing comes up. You have to raise women's consciousness to the point where they begin to accept the fact that there's other choices. There's other options. And then there's Ada James. Ada James was was both in favor of prohibition, and she was also a member. She basically agreed with the free love movement. Interestingly, here's a picture of her deciding to hire a boat to take her up and down the Wolf River and the Wisconsin River to various communities and handing out leaflets and promoting the right of women to vote. And then notice there's also another woman named, I don't think I have it. Oh, there she is. Here we go. I didn't have the thing. Yeah. Helen Harbert of Kenosha, who noticed a more modern approach. what women need is equal pay for equal work. We need protection so we can have shorter hours, workplace safety, and legislation to protect us in general. Because there were 7 million working women who basically were at the mercy of their employers. It was during this time, I believe it was 1911, that the shirtwaist factory fire took place that really kind of changed the dynamics of a lot of that, where hundreds of women were trapped inside of a building during a fire and died. It was a horrible, horrible thing. Now, women did get the right to vote, or did begin to work towards the right to vote, more accurately. And they finally won the right to vote in school elections in 1886, but you can see by a relatively small margin, but hey, one vote is all it took. So as of that, women could vote in school elections. They couldn't vote for president. They couldn't vote for a member of the House. They couldn't vote for the Wisconsin Assembly or the Wisconsin Senate. They could vote for whoever was running for the school board. That's where they were. Now notice, though, the language was vague because it said any election pertaining to school matters. Well, Brown says that's just about everything. There's all kinds of elections that influence school matters, not just a school board election. And she sought to vote in a municipal election, that is a city election in Racine in 1887. But her vote was rejected. But a judge, you can see him over here on the left, John B. Winslow, overruled that and said that women were entitled to vote at election and for all candidates, because he agreed that any election pertaining to school matters basically meant any election. Well, that was taken to the Wisconsin Supreme Court. That's what this is, Geike versus McKinley. That this was, that the law itself was illegal because it did not create a separate ballot for school board elections and for other elections. So a woman who voted for everything, no one would be able to know whether that was a woman casting that ballot or if it was a man casting that ballot. So that was part of the problem. So basically what this decision says is the whole law is unconstitutional, it's illegal, and therefore women lost the right to vote in 1890 after having gained it in school elections in 1886. So again, it's the long and winding road. It's it's a little bit here and a little bit there. And then finally in 1901, it still took 11 years. Finally, the state legislature mandated there be a separate ballot for school board elections and another ballot for other elections. And that way a woman would receive the ballot for the school board and not receive the other one. So women had gained something, and like all things twists and turns, they lost it. You can see lots of attempts to in the state to give women the right to vote on various things. Again, it didn't have to go all the way completely to voting on every election, but they all failed. Over 21. That's called a slump. Hopefully the Cubs will be in one of those pretty soon. I'm not sure, but hopefully. But they all failed. And then in 1912, the big one was a referendum, is that should women be given the right to vote? And by an overwhelming majority, I'm looking at 63 to 37. That is a Russian-style election. It was defeated. Only 14 counties voted in the majority for giving women the right to vote. And this kind of happened throughout the whole Midwest. You can see here some of the opposition. The people who are opposed, notice it's a menace to the home, men's employment, and to all business. wasn't it Sandra Day O'Connor who, when she applied for a lawyer's job in Phoenix after she graduated, like top of her class at Stanford, who was told, well, you certainly are qualified, ma'am, but you know, a man needs this job, and for you, it's just something to do. So if women are equal, women are going to take things that should have been man's because they have to have those. Now here's the favor one, the same one, although this says the laws. Oh, right. So this is the again the referendum, and going around the country were women in favor of this. Catherine McCullough, and notice this is in front of. Now I don't know where that would be in Sister Bay. Maybe some of you would know way better than I. Where this store, this post office was in Sister Bay. I'm sure the original building is gone, but that's a little bit of a picture of Sister Bay in 1912, which is kind of interesting all by itself. But there they were, like some on a boat up on the Wolf River. Others were in cars going from town to town, trying to get women the right, get women at least, and men, their husbands, to support the right to vote. Imagine the travel in Door County in 1912 was interesting. Probably not as crowded, but probably even took longer just to get from spot to spot on those dirt roads. It actually works too. But here you can see all these states from 1912 through 1914. All those states voted against women's suffrage. And, you know, Michigan, at least it was close. But the only other state where the majority was not over 10,000 was North Dakota. And it's still basically it's still a pretty good percentage. I mean, notice in Ohio, it was crushed, 182,000. The margin was 182,000. Missouri didn't have much of a chance. I mean, this is just what was going on. The women's suffrage movement was by the mid-teens, if you will, of the 20th century was meeting defeat after defeat. Didn't look very rosy. Didn't look like there was much light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak. So now the work is going to become, we've tried this state by state thing. Obviously, as we saw on the last slide, it wasn't working. And now we are going to begin to work towards a national effort. And they began to get other groups like the Women's Trade Union League, the National Consumers League, and it was also to adopt the moral purity argument. One of the reasons was that was linked to the progressive movement, which was very strong at this time. That what some politicians began to see is that a way to get progressive legislation passed was to enlist the aid of women who could vote. And that would include the pure vote, although that was already passed, but there are lots of laws that to protect workers and so on, that began to get the support of these groups, and they began to use the moral purity argument that women were more moral and were the voice of that in society, and therefore had to be given the right to vote. Then Kat, as we've seen, becomes president of the National Women's Suffrage Association. In fact, they joined together the National American one, like the NFL used to have two leagues and formed in the NFL. She developed a winning state plan, state by state, but that was that was rejected. It did have some success in New York and Arkansas, but by this time, the movement had been taken over by a younger, much more impatient generation of women who were basically saying, without saying it specifically, you've tried, you've failed, it's our turn. And one of those was Alice Paul. Oops, I don't know, I don't have a picture there. But Alice Paul, and she formed a completely separate organization called Congressional Union that wanted a federal equal rights amendment and it used much more confrontational tactics. We're not going to just go up and down a river in a boat. We're not going to drive around to give like people in isolated communities something to do by hanging out at the local post office to see these women come around. We're going to picket. We're going to have mass rallies. We're going to have marches. We're going to raise consciousness through those efforts. And its strategy was, it doesn't matter who's in power. We're not picking sides on the partisan lineup. If you're in office, we're going to go after you. We're going to support the other parties' candidates if they will support women's suffrage. And in some cases, that's going to be Republicans. Some cases, that's going to be Democrats. On the date, they were hoping Wilson might give them some aid here. It took him a long time to do so. He finally came around. They marched the day before he was inaugurated in 1913, and 11 women were arrested. In fact, there are lots of occasions where a woman's march might be surrounded by a bunch of drunken men who would throw stuff at them and actually smack them around. That was not unheard of. And here are some of those marches. And you notice the one here on the bottom, that's the Wisconsin delegation, who were involved in this march, right behind Oregon there. And then they began again to picket the White House. And Paul's explanation was, so the guys either got to get rid of the creditor or you got to pay the bill. In other words, you're going to take an act where you're going to arrest us. That's going to gain us notoriety. It may sound familiar to the nonviolent approach used by Martin Luther King, that the act of being arrested and being beat up awakened America's consciousness to the injustice of what was going on in the 50s. And then they, again, you want us to fight this war by 1916, where, well, not in December of 16, but certainly by August of 17, when Wilson got reelected in 16, he ran on the platform of he kept us out of war. He took office in March of 17. By April of 17, he was asking Congress to declare war on Germany and to make this the war to end all wars, to make democracy safe. But what they said is that's kind of hypocritical. You promote democracy in Europe, but you deny it at home by opposing giving women the right to vote. Now, realize Wilson's role would have been purely, to use the term, a bully pulpit. If their goal was a national amendment, the president has no direct constitutional role in the writing of an amendment resolution or the passage of the amendment resolution or the ratification. He can use his voice to be in favor of or opposed, but that's it. Kaiser Wilson, they began to call him, the emperor, the dictator, as a way to get under his skin. And then their offices were attacked, their pickets were arrested, they were sent to jail. You can see a picture of that right there. And then it says, notice, it's very hard to read up here, but it says, look what happened when you get Jeanette Rankin in Congress. Jeanette Rankin was the first woman elected to the House of Representatives. And she is the only person who voted against both American entry into World War I and into World War II, which I think is kind of an interesting fact to know and tell. But here's some more. When they began to get, they got put in jail. You can see here, Helena Weed got sent to jail, and finally, Paul herself was arrested. For a while, there was a resistance to arresting her, but finally it was done. And like other prisoners, when she refused to eat, she was force-fed. And then She finally was released after public outcry and Wilson's shifting position. And as he said, at first Wilson tried to remove the creditor, that is to arrest the picketers, but later he decided to pay the bill, that is to support an amendment. And in January of 18, he says, I'm in favor of it. Just after that, the next day, a resolution passed in the House but failed in the Senate. So it was done for that year. Now, in 1918 or 1915, the Wisconsin delegation in the House had opposed giving the right to vote to women by a vote of 9-2. Largely Republicans, not all. Then in 18, the state legislature passed a resolution favoring a federal amendment. And by May 21 of 1919, the delegation had 9 Republicans and 1 socialist, voted 8-2 against, in favor of the amendment. There was 1 seat that was yet unfilled. One of those was the socialist member from Milwaukee, Victor Berger, who you see there on your left, when Milwaukee had socialists who were elected to both the House and to the position of mayor in the city of Milwaukee. And finally, on this day, 100 years ago, it was passed, it was ratified, and there you can see what it actually says. So in a sense, inherent in this, the right to vote can be denied for, can be denied for some reasons, but not on account of sex. Notice I didn't use the word gender, although that is more of a modern construct. But still, that's what the amendment says. It doesn't, so basically all those states that had denied women the right to vote, once this was finally ratified today, and then went into effect, I believe, as we heard on August 26th, women could no longer be denied the right to vote, and voted in the November elections of 1920. So that's what I have for us today. I hope you enjoyed it, and that you learned something, and or if not, at least you got a good nap in, one or the other.
So thank you, Larry. You can stop sharing your screen now, so we'll see you again. How is it they justified not giving Black women the right to vote until much later? I'm wondering, does anyone have any ideas?
Well, according to the 19th Amendment, Black women did receive the right to vote.
Yes, they did.
Right. Because they were, can you see me yet, or?
No.
Yeah, see, there we go. Well, now?
No.
Yeah. See, there's still a few bugs in the system. I don't know where. Well, you get the first. This would be the first group that actually said they wanted to see me in my life, so I'm a little surprised and confused by this. So I don't really know what's going on. I'll try to figure out how to do it. But
didn't the 19th Amendment guarantee the Black women the right to vote as well?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
I thought there was an argument over that. That the Republicans were angry.
Well, racial. I don't have a video to start, so I don't know what. I'm going to X out of that. Is that all right? Can you see that? It says the host has asked you to start your video. I don't have a video, so I'm not going to do that. But anyway, again, I'm still working on this. But yeah, I mean, the same arguments that were used, just because Black women were given the right to vote by the 19th Amendment didn't mean that they actually exercised the right to vote in Alabama and Mississippi any more than men did. Black men.
Poll tax.
Yeah, poll tax, right. Just, a literacy test. I had a copy. I used to, I'm telling you, there's nobody here well, let me just say this, 99 out of 100 Americans would never possibly pass that literacy test. There's no way. It's intricate
Right.
parts of the Constitution. And when was the last time anybody read the Constitution?
Right.
You know, I mean, but on the other hand, that didn't really matter, because the thing is, the person who gave the test said, you're black, you fail. And in many southern states, they also used it against poor whites as well. You know, whoever was the registrar just said, you're done, you're done, you're done. And it wasn't until the 40s that the white primaries were ruled to be unconstitutional. And then the Voting Rights Act and the poll tax amendment came in the 60s, and that's what opened up voting for most Americans. But so white women gained the right to vote in 1920, but black women did not, unless they lived in a northern state. They didn't share in that. That was part of the problem.
Oh, man.
Other questions? See, as I told Laura, if I always want to end discussion, I ask if there are questions. That's what I do in my high school class when I was getting close to the, you know, we got to wrap things up. So it's any questions. And of course, anybody who make class go a little bit longer than what it needed to be, that they would become like pariah in a high school. So that we were done. That was part of the deal. Anything else?
Well, thank you for
you guys for doing this. I
doing it.
appreciate it. I'm honored that you would spend your
Yeah,
time with
thank
me.
you.